Africa is very open for business. We have a lot going for us. An estimated $3 trillion market opportunity through the African Continental Free Trade Area. The agreements that are embedded in there. The continent attracts low-cost manufacturing opportunities, raising manufacturing potential. The business environment, we are told, is improving, along with macroeconomic governance and a vast reserve of young labour talent. In this special feature, The Full View talks to two experts on how we can exponentially grow intra-African economic collaboration and use the human, natural and innovation resources in abundance on the continent to our advantage. Professor Dr. Ambassador Tal Edgars is an African scholar and Group Executive Chair of GBSH Consult Group Worldwide and Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at trade collective Lebohang Pheko, who also sits on the National Planning Committee, is joining us as well. Welcome to each of you. Thank you very much for your time. There's a lot to talk about, so we're just going to have to behave ourselves in this conversation and keep it super focused, because we'll start with the opportunities and then we'll get to the impediments to Africa's growth. So let's kick off. And Lebohang, maybe I'll kick off with you. What is the biggest opportunity, based on your experience and everything that you've been observing, for Africa's growth right now?
Oh, gosh, there's so many, actually. There's how long is a piece of string? I think that the one thing that we can see is that the notion of industrialization across the continent has regained currency. And it is difficult to talk about Africa as a continent because this is 54 very different asymmetrical economies with 54 very different contexts and specificities, different commodities flows, different currency valuations, and so on. But generally, I think the one opportunity is for us to trade more vigorously internally, and certainly the Africa Free Trade Agreement offers us this opportunity. It offers us the opportunity, in fact, to grow our economy if the statistics are to be believed. I mean, we're told that in the next 20 to 30 years, actually, by 2050, the African continent is probably going to account for about 80% of the world's population, and that there's an expectation that they're going to be a much larger consumer base, and also a consumer base that isn't interested per se in internalizing what comes from abroad, but rather consuming what is produced locally and what that is really created in our own image, and a very niche, nuanced market, which is very exciting. The other piece of that, of course, is that there's the expectation of higher value food production, which means our agricultural sector has to be amped up much more. There is a whole discourse around urbanization, but I do think that it's very important to remember that a large proportion and a large majority of this continent is still a rural population, and that there's the opportunity there to remember that we can begin to rethink value addition, and not just the rhetoric of value addition, but the real implementation of value addition that is linked to food sovereignty, that is linked to ending hunger on this continent autonomously, and that is also linked to the other ways in which a healthy and well-nourished continent can then begin to produce and reproduce itself in the knowledge economy and so forth. But those basic fundamentals, I think, are a very important opportunity.
I knew I was going to get in trouble asking a question, as you say, that spans so many different countries, languages, governance, regulation, even the demographics in those countries are different. And so that was a real challenge for you to answer, but I'm glad that you did in the way that you did. So Tal, let me turn it over to you. Given that complexity, then but I can't say one instrument, but what are some of the instruments that we do have at our disposal? In fact, I was having a conversation a couple of minutes ago about the African Union, but what other instruments, including that one, do we have to make sure that we can tie all these threads together in a tapestry that is powerful and represents the kind of powerhouse that Africa can be from an economic and even a social perspective?
Thank you so much, Iman. I think one of the things that is going to be important will be looking at the tariff book within the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement and looking at what the rules of origin are going to be, because we are lost in the interpretation as to what exactly is going to become tied into the technicalities or the legalities of it. And if you were to pay so much attention to it, we are already at a point where 80% of the 8,000 products that are listed in Africa on the World Customs Organization's harmonized systems of rules of origin are already being negotiated. So there's bigger potential for us to actually get to 100% rules of origin convergence. What that will mean is that traders in Africa will create an enabling environment. We will include robust market information, and much of that will be incentives to power their businesses. So I do think that at the end of the day, if we were to also align ourselves to the Futures Report of 2021, we would see what would be the biggest part of catalyzing and looking at the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement toolbox and how will it enable the private sector.
What's your awareness then, just as a follow-up to that, amongst people who want to use and unlock this opportunity that the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement provides? And of course, in a sense, some might say it's in an experimentation phase. You know, it was launched, it was supposed to come alive, I think, just before the start of COVID. So there have been some setbacks in as far as really understanding and experiencing the massive potential that it has. But for people who want to access the opportunity that you're talking about, where's the first step to start?
I think quite recently there was the release of the Africa Continental Free Trade ACBI report, which was supposed to align the region, the continent, and businesses to be able to interpret how exactly we can get this aspiration even closer. The Agenda 2063 is a little bit far for us to align to. And so the ACBI report is what would be able to integrate national, regional, and continental levels, acknowledging what are the mishaps that are happening within the trade environment. Because just from the private to the government, we are having a little bit of an issue. And so I'd talk about much more about the 4 pillars for the Africa Free Trade in another setting.
All right, then maybe if there's time, we can loop back to that. But Lebohang, in 2020, Africa's population under 35 represents almost 1 billion people, and almost half of that represents this really key age group between 15 and 34. It's a stunning opportunity to educate and deploy for the growth that we want, but how well are we utilizing this opportunity?
So we keep talking about this demographic dividend, this demographic bulge. But I mean, we also have to remember that that's also the age group where there's almost 80% of unemployment. That's an age group that's often very vulnerable to all sorts of insurgencies across the continent because of the lack of opportunities, the lack of employment, the lack of further education. This is also the age group that is quite easily radicalized into all sorts of causes as a result of really having a sense of, no sense of real aspirations or no sense of any sense of hope, really. And I think that when we speak about this demographic dividend, we have to be very careful not to instrumentalize it as though these are just these are just figures. These are people. These are real young people who oftentimes our education system and our employment structure and the economic structure of our continent has not really accommodated or has not really understood how to best utilize them. And I do think that there are a few things that are quite useful. The one is that, our education system, particularly across Southern Africa, is not particularly entrepreneurial. And I think that if, the whole notion of walking into employment and hoping that there's going to be opportunities, our governments have often found themselves lacking in this regard. The second piece of that is the kind of education which is much more entrepreneurial, which is that enables young people to be versatile, to be solutions orientated, to be able to transfer skills from one sector to the other, from one country to the other, from between urban and city contexts and so forth, to be really much more malleable and agile and responsive. And also, I think another piece of that is that we do need. At some stage, certainly in our history, there was a much greater impetus on the idea of cross-border, of inter-country skills transfers. And I don't think that as a continent we've been able to utilize and to really leverage on that, especially as the SADC, for example. There are all these protocols which speak to this. And that would be a really great opportunity for young people, I think, to not only be contained to a particular geography and national geography, but to really view this continent as one that is full of possibility for them and where they can create opportunities for themselves across different contexts as well. So I do think that when we speak about young people, we have to be careful not to speak about them and at them as though they are just these floating statistics, but rather that they are really, if we're not able to speak into their context appropriately, deal with the unemployment situations and deal with the structural deficits of our economies, where we might not see them as a blessing in future. We might see them as a huge population which that is not able to realize their potential fully.
So how do we make that jump then, Lebohang? And I want to stay with this question a little bit longer because I think it is very, very important, especially when we conceive, of a continent that is growing in a healthy way, that is taking everyone along in that whole growth trajectory. Whose responsibility is it then to create the kind of meaningful activation that you're saying is needed to make sure that people not only graduate with the skills or have the opportunity for education, have the skills in their hands to do something, and then find themselves in meaningful occupation that allows them to advance their lives?
I would say primarily our states, Imani. I would primarily say that it's really the role of particularly a good public education, which is then which is a state function, which is exactly a state function. And I think that it's also important then to think around what we view as a good career and a good education. The problem is that also that there is this fetishization, I think, of careerism on the continent, which is, which suggests that if you're not going into an office and working off of a laptop, somehow what you're not doing is not of value. And I think that we have really neglected the opportunities for artisanal skills and artisanal skills capacity, which really for many reasons will always be an important industry. Many of the white collar jobs that we are aware of today are going to become obsolete. We're working our way into obsoletes in the next maybe 10, 20 or 30 years. And I do believe that, we don't want to talk about things like the bridge between secondary school education, technical education, and a tertiary education. And I think that we really need to create the sorts of economies where young people are able to enter the workforce and enter the market economy at multiple points, and using multiple pathways, Imani. So, for example, not only from high school, but for potentially technical school, which begins at grade 8 or grade 9, where you can then learn a skill, whatever it might be, brickmaking, architecture, hairdressing, computer science, or whatever. And the other part of that is then that this has to be linked with some form of entrepreneurial, market development, market analysis sort of skill. Because I think many curriculums across our continent have this sort of fuzzy social science, life orientation. In South Africa, we're very fond of life orientation. And that exactly is the kind of discipline or the kind of subject where one would hope that a sort of a much more flexible, agile, dynamic way of seeing the workforce would be one that could be imbued into the curriculum formally. Because, of course, as we appreciate, tertiary education is an expense that is quite prohibitive for many young people and for many of their families.
Yeah, when you use the words agile and dynamic, like sometimes I think that those would be the last two, descriptors that I would use with regard to organizations or institutions that are meant to be activating and getting things done in that kind of agile and responsive manner.
That's the whole problem, exactly.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you. And listen, just have a relaxed conversation. We've got a few more minutes, which is really wonderful. So if you want to interject with each other, that's absolutely fine. But Tal, as a continent, according to the African Development Bank, only 40% of Africans have access to electricity. And that in itself is just, it's mind-blowing. We have the least access to electricity in the world. So we know the story because it's happening right here in South Africa as well. Businesses have to provide it for themselves. They may use generators or whatever else. It's costly. It's bad for the environment. And we also see the problems created through this. If we can't get it right, how are we going to talk about the existential things?
I think you're asking a very fundamental question, and that rolls back then to what the statistics look like. I would love to throw out numbers, but then we are only looking at things that are not enabled within the environment that we're in. We're talking about a very basic function of every business and how much we're losing while we're talking about electricity. But let's roll it back to how far it's gone when you talk about rural electrification. And this goes as far as places that they don't have the bare minimum. So as much as we have powered up and we are going back to an industrial revolution where we are having much more that is done within the cities and not much that is done in places where we could be able to actually, spark up areas of employment. So if you go around Africa, you'll actually find that electricity is an issue. Now, the infrastructure gap, the last time that they were talking about this, and I remember Right Honorable Raila Odinga talking about the gap being that we would have to finance again half of what was already a deficit, and now with COVID, it was not going to happen. I think the first things we have to ask ourselves is, what are the priorities for Africa this time around, right? And being Africa Month, what really animated us into thinking about a joint idea of the Organization of African Unity and now into the African Union, because some of those aspirations are lost to us, right? We are talking about basics that would diversify, whether we are talking about youth employment. Regardless of us creating youth employment, they are not in the epicenter of the economy. The youth are actually in the periphery of the economy. So if you look at small business today, the role that small business is playing in advancing policy making is not the same as big business, right? And so we have so many indabas we're going to keep throwing in. We have got so many of these organizations of higher learning institutions that we're going to throw in. But the question is, what is the priorities that we're willing to shift to move into the periphery of the economy and say, this is where it's going to work? Now, can we draw that down to other countries that it has worked? It has worked for Rwanda. They have focused on agriculture. They have been able to move up in terms of world business rankings. Let us look at Kenya. They have been able to think about cryptocurrency and using digitalization in things like M-Pesa. And then we come back to South Africa and we say, why are we not creating an enabling environment? Why are we not fast-tracking simple dynamics in business that would be able to create that employment? And what is the cost of creating employment? What's the cost per job? If to create one job is 100,000 Rand, and we are talking to investors, how do we go around creating this into policy? Because there's always a vacuum between the fifth administration and the sixth administration, and nothing keeps moving. So there's always this starting phase again. We keep starting after every 5 years. And what was done in the last 5 years is really not accentuated enough for us to say we can see where it's going. And that becomes a bigger play when we look at what the priority was.
You know, I hope this doesn't come off in a bad way, but I'm so tired of hearing, you know, when we look at the stars in Africa, we must always talk about Rwanda. I wish there were more, you know, there were other countries in that concentric circle of success and of brilliance as well, that we can begin to, you know, we can begin to add more and more in at least as far as Rwanda is concerned with getting things done, turning around, the ability of people to register their companies, visas, and all of those different things that they've put in place to just make life simpler and easier. But I want to stay with this concept of electrification. And Lebohang, you know, if we think about this massive problem then that the access to electricity is posing, not just for families and households, but also for businesses and the economy. And maybe you please educate us in this moment, and you know, it could just be me that's ignorant, but surely we should be then driving, the production of solar and solar products on the African continent, but manufacturing and, the entire supply and value chain resting in the continent of Africa. From your vantage point as part of the solution to this problem, do you see that happening in a way that's also driven by young people, that they're given the reins to run with these things?
I love your hope for an environment that's going to be created to, in fact, enable young people to perform at their maximum potential. I mean, I think it is a huge challenge. And as my co-panelist has already said, there are about over 600 million African people who don't have access, who are energy poor, right? And energy poverty is a huge issue on this continent. And I think when we talk about the per capita consumption of energy across the African continent, it's about 180 kilowatts as opposed to about 13,000 kilowatts in the US and 6,500 kilowatts across Europe. So we are far, we don't consume as much energy as we need, commensurate to colleagues across other regions. But we, even in that lack of capacity, we are not able to access it enough. And it's crucial for not only business, but it's also crucial for educational and, of course, health outcomes. And I think I would that we begin to view access to energy as part of a social compact, if you will, a kind of a socio-economic, social infrastructural compact, which is not only for unlocking economic opportunity and job creation and so forth, but also for unlocking, human opportunity. I mean, insufficient energy in and of itself can cause hundreds and thousands of deaths, and it's also to do with unsafe cooking and other sources of fuel, which often can cause hazards hazards, fires, and so forth. And then, of course, it can also compromise educational attainment. And if you're asking again, Imani, about young people, the notion of productivity and a productive day where young people are doing their homework through, using candlelight and so forth, which not only has its own visual risks and its own health, safety risks, but of course it means that you're just not able to do as much over a day. And I think it's also useful to link that with the whole idea of where Africa's energy potential lies, especially as you rightly say, renewable energy and so forth, which is only a fraction of what we're using so far. Another part of that is you talked about solar power. There's also hydropower, which provides around about 1/5 of capacity, but not even 1/10 of its total potential is being provided so far. And so, there's so many. I mean, wind energy, geothermal, and so forth. There's so much. And I mean, I think that, even while we're debating around fossil fuels and so forth, it is important for us to think about how we're going to finance a state-of-the-art future energies grid, which is inclusive, which has environmental integrity, but which, as I say, is part of a much stronger social economic compact to really enhance the lives of all of us on a day-to-day level on the African continent.
I can really see that the two of you know your stuff, and you also enjoy this conversation, which is why I'm enjoying it. And I'm so sad that it's actually in its last moments. But Tal, maybe just a quick one for you then. If you had to think of 2 things that we should be doing now to really, effectively catalyze us and sort of catapult us into the arena of progress that we should be in, what would it be?
I wouldn't even have 2 things. I think it's just broken down to one. Let's stop the politicking, right? We tend to have this so much more in Africa, where everything seems to be like it needs an act of parliament. But on my part, and I hold the objective view that all we need is political goodwill, right? If we can be able, and you're looking at, when you talked about the electricity challenge, and we're talking about 600 million people of the 1.2 billion Africans who are not part of that gap, then you look at the flip side of it, we've got 12 million people who enter the workforce every year. So we have quite a huge number of people who are putting pressure on the resources that we already have. What does that mean? It means we need political goodwill. Let us stop making this thing sound like we need to ratify an entire constitution. We don't need to sit around parliament and discuss these items. We do not need another Indaba to talk about how much we need power. What we need to do is act. And for as long as that is the issue we have, we will forever keep on talking about it.
Well, my hope is that, that the more we have these conversations and more people can hear, they will recognize where the problems are, and people will begin to activate their own individual agency. Doesn't matter what country they're in or where they find themselves, in a way that can do something that moves us in a different direction. Hope to see the pair of you in a conversation again in future. It's much needed. Thank you very much for your insights tonight.